When I was 17, I lived with my grandparents in a tucked-away, suburban neighborhood in Social. I was very social back then, partied a lot, and was out doing something basically every single night, getting home anywhere from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. We had only lived there for maybe 6 months and only had one key. The neighborhood was all old white people and some younger families, all upper middle class, and no one drove into our street unless they lived there or knew someone who did. My family was always home, so I never took the Soul House key. Also, the front door and back sliding door were always unlocked and open so I could come home at any time of the night and then locked it behind me. Also, my husky liked to sleep outside and liked to come in and out as she pleased, which is the main reason the slider was always open all night. I'll circle back to why mentioning my dog is important in a bit. Fast forward to a random night. I was out with a friend of mine. No recollection of what we did that night. We probably went to someone's house and did a bunch of coke until 3 a.m. She then drives me home and drops me off at about 3:45 a.m. I say my goodbyes and then head inside and lock the door behind me. I go into the kitchen and pop a cup of noodles in the microwave. About 5 minutes later, I go upstairs to my room. My room was on the second floor, directly above the garage and driveway. Looking out, you see about 50 yards away, the entrance to my street was shaped like the letter P. So anyone who drove into my street, I could clearly see, and they would have to loop around and pass our house to leave the same road. This is when I looked out of my window and saw them. My lights were already on, and my curtains already drawn from when I left in a hurry earlier. I walked up to the window to shut the curtains. I then looked down into my driveway, where between my grandparents' 4 parked cars stood a very large man staring up into my window. Dead still, blank stare. He was Hispanic, late 20s to early 30s, about 6'2", and at least 250 pounds. I immediately dropped to the floor, but there's no way he didn't already see me. As I dropped, I saw another man walking out from my gate next to the driveway, coming out from the inside towards the other man. I heard some brief speaking from the man who came out of the gate and couldn't understand what language it was, but it was not English. Oddly, it didn't sound Spanish either. After I dropped to the floor, I crawled to my grandparents' office, which sat directly next to my room and had a window that also faced the driveway. The lights were off in there, so I could look out without being seen. The man who I saw standing between our cars was still standing there staring and motionless. The other man was looking around and pointing to my house. I nearly vomited. I crawled to my grandparents' room down the hall. I was crawling because the upper level was loft style, where you can see the whole lower level and out the glass front door and windows. I frantically knocked on their door trying to stay quiet, as not to tip off these men, because I wanted them to be caught and questioned by the police. My grandparents finally woke up and could barely understand me because I was shaking so badly and my words were just spilling out. My grandpa, being the fearless, grumpy old man he is, then put on his robe and decided to walk outside and investigate himself. I then called the cops and watched from the upstairs window to make sure nothing happened to him. By the time he went outside and stood in the driveway, the men were gone from my sight. A few moments later, a car sped out of our street, lights off, and no license plate. He told me once he came back inside that when he went out there, they were parked next to my next door neighbor's car in her driveway, with the car on, but lights off, and the seats reclined. He said it looked like they were sleeping, or pretending to. When they looked over and saw him, they backed out, and then sped off. The cops took a whopping 30 minutes to show up, didn't want my descriptions of the men or the car. They said lock the doors, and if they come back, Call the cops. They drove around my street for a bit, and then left. Great. Thanks for the help. My grandma thought I was just on drugs and didn't feel the level of urgency or danger that I felt. My grandpa was also very nonchalant, even though he saw them, which pissed me off and made me feel even more helpless. I slept on the floor of their room from that night on until about 3 months later. That wasn't the end though. So, now about my husky. Her name is Nala, and at that time, she was about 2. She's small for a husky, about 50 pounds. But to people who aren't super familiar with dogs, she looks pretty threatening. She chose to always sleep outside, which is why we always left the slider to the backyard open. Now about a month ago or so, before that night I saw those men. I was in the backyard and saw Nala chewing on something. She has possession aggression with certain things, like bones, small animals, and things she's stolen. That basically means when you go near her and she's in that state, she growls, flashes her teeth, snarls and lunges, and if you dare to reach your hand out as if to take what she has, you'll lose that hand. When I walked up to her, she lunged at me. She had a steak, a rotten, moldy, obviously old T-bone steak. Looked like she'd been working on it for a while. I asked my grandparents. They didn't give it to her. I asked my neighbors if they maybe threw her one over the fence. They had no idea what I was talking about. I then didn't think anything of it, until it happened 4 more times. On 4 separate occasions, I found her with rotten meat clinging to the T-bone steak. I threw them away each time I found them, so I knew they were new. I asked my neighbors again, thinking they maybe thought I was mad. They were giving my dog food and lying to me. Nothing. Like I said, this was coincidentally happening in the weeks leading up to that night I saw those men. The event that made me start to connect the dots between the steaks Nala was finding and these men happened the second time I encountered the men. Fast forward to about 3 months after the initial event. I hadn't slept in my room since, and I went on a trip to Europe to visit some family for a month. Nothing had happened since that night, but the trauma and fear were very real. It made me lose weight. I stayed up all night listening to every noise I heard and analyzing it, peeking out the windows every couple of minutes until 6 a.m. I was a wreck. While I was out of the country, I came to terms with everything in my own mind and decided I had to stop living like how I was, in constant fear. What were those men going to do to me if I hadn't seen them? If they wanted to break in and rob us? Most all of us were gone during the day, most days a week for at least a few hours. Why wait for everyone to be home? If they were peeping Toms, they could have parked on my street and watched me all night, and I would have never known. I think they were going to try to take me. Trafficking maybe. I should mention I am a model and have had a decently big social media following. I do a lot of live streams. I'm very interactive with my followers and had been in the spotlight online since I was 13. I got back from Europe, and about a week later or so, I decided I was going to finally go out again. It was the first day where I really felt okay and not so afraid. I got used to things being normal again and was excited to move on from the whole thing. That night, I went out. I got home earlier, about 1 to 2 a.m., and had my key this time. We started locking the doors after that night. My friend waited for me to go through my gate and get to my door before leaving. As I pulled out my keys and walking up to the door, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I thought I'm being paranoid. It's just an animal. To help form a better picture, you walk through a 3-foot-tall swing-open gate adjacent to the driveway and about 6 steps down a path to the front door. and a small 3-foot gate to the backyard is adjacent to the front door to the left. When I heard the rustling, I instinctively flashed my unlocked phone screen in that direction for light to look into the pitch-black backyard. At that exact moment, I did that. Someone about 4 feet in front of me, in my backyard, flashed their phone screen, as if they were investigating the same way I was. I didn't see the person, just the phone screen, which had a text convo open on it. I noted that it wasn't an iPhone. I let out a gasp, and they whipped around the corner, back into the backyard, and I bolted inside the front door. I ran to the back slider and slammed it and locked it, and then ran upstairs while calling the police. That entire interaction outside happened in about 10 seconds. The police showed up and did nothing at all, just like before. After talking with them for a while, I went upstairs to my room and peered out the window as they spoke to my grandparents. As I was scanning the street from the window, I heard a whistle coming from directly below me. It was that whistle people do when trying to get someone's attention, or when calling your dog back to you, as if communicating with his buddy saying, "Cops are here, let's dip." My theory about the stakes, though, is that these men were stalking me and casing our house for at least a month before I saw them that first night. They must have seen my dog, and not knowing that she doesn't bark or attack strangers, they baited her with stakes to gain her trust so they could go into the backyard without a problem. We moved a couple months later due to something unrelated. I never saw them again. To this day, I struggle with the PTSD those events caused me. I have lived in constant fear and paranoia ever since. I can't be alone at night, at all. I think the reason it affects me so much is because they were never caught. No one knows what their end goal was. And the worst part for me, how the fuck did they find me? Did they follow me home from seeing me somewhere in public one night? Were they some of the gardeners who often mowed the lawn around me as I laid out and tanned? Were they some of the workers that redid our roof for weeks on end, a month or so before any of this happened? Did one of the workers tell a friend there was a hot teenage girl who always left her curtains open? Did they find me through social media? I'll never know, and it kills me. I still hear that whistle every now and then. Honestly, it might be auditory hallucinations at this point. I don't know. I'll never know who those men were or what their intentions were. But regardless, let's not meet again.